So when is the New Jerusalem? It might be a silly question because you're probably already thinking, of course, it's at the end of the millennium. But why do people think that? People think it's at the end only because they think the entire book of Revelation is chronological. One after the other after the other. And when you get to the New Jerusalem, it's at the end, so it's like the last thing that happens. Well, ask yourself this question. Where do God and Jesus reign during the millennium? That's a fair question. But I also want to show you a couple verses that actually suggest that it's not chronological. So just real quick, I'm not going to take a whole video on this, but if you follow with me in Revelation 20, this is talking about the millennium. This is talking about the 1,000 years. So basically, Jesus comes back and Satan is bound for 1,000 years. And then at the end of that 1,000 years, Satan is released for a little while, has one final rebellion, but God smites them all down with fire from heaven. And then at the end of Revelation 20, you have the great white throne judgment, where all of death and Hades are thrown into the lake of fire. So this is basically starting the eternal state. All of sin, all of death, everything like that is thrown into the lake of fire. And then the very next chapter and the next verse is talking about the new heavens and the new earth. John says, I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and first earth passed away. And then he saw the New Jerusalem coming down out of heaven, like a bride adorned for her husband. Following the progression here, that makes sense so far. But if we go to the end of chapter 21, I want to read a verse right here. But there shall by no means enter into the New Jerusalem anything that defiles or causes abomination or a lie, but only those who are written in the Lamb's book of life. So what happened in the previous chapter at the very end? Death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. So why is there still sin? Right, we're talking about the New Jerusalem. This is the eternal state now. Why is there still sin? But there's also another verse. If we go to chapter 22, verse 15. But outside of the gates, outside of the walls of the New Jerusalem, outside are dogs and sorcerers and sexually immoral and murderers and idolaters and whoever loves and practices a lie. These are not saints, right? These are clearly sinners. These are clearly unrepentant non-Christians that do not belong inside the New Jerusalem. Because everything inside the New Jerusalem is pure and holy. Nothing can enter into it that defiles or causes an abomination, like we read before. So where are these people coming from? All of sin was supposed to be done away with by this point, by the eternal state time. So let's just for a minute, let's disconnect what we've learned, what we've thought for so long, and just disconnect this idea that the New Jerusalem comes at the end of the millennium, and let's stick it at the beginning of the millennium. And let's see if that makes any more sense.
I may never march in the infantry, but my feet are firm with the gospel of peace and the sword of the Spirit at my right hand.
I may never ride in the cavalry, but the belt of truth and the breastplate of righteousness are my defense and security.
I may never shoot the artillery, but I will take up the shield of faith and extinguish the deceiving darts of the devil.
And I may never fly over the enemy, but my mind is protected by the helmet of salvation.
We are the Lord's army.
Well, hello, and thanks for watching the Godly Rebels channel. My name is JD. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up. If you learned something, why not share it with a friend so they can learn it too. So as I pointed out in the introduction to this video, there are some inconsistencies if the New Jerusalem is at the end of the millennium, because that's the beginning of the eternal state at that point. There's supposed to be no more sin anymore. Everything is cast into the lake of fire. So what I'm going to do in this video is give you two different paths that actually both lead to the New Jerusalem being at the beginning of the millennium, just after Jesus' second coming. That's where I'm putting the New Jerusalem. It's going to make a lot more sense. So just hang in there. Let's go through these passages, and then at the end we'll draw conclusions and see if it makes more sense, the New Jerusalem coming down out of heaven in the beginning of the millennium or at the end. And then as a bonus, I'm going to really quickly go through the feasts, the Lord's feasts. There are 7 of them, and show you how those line up perfectly with the New Jerusalem at the beginning of the millennium as well. So for this first path, we're going to have to draw some dots and connect the dots, right? So I'm going to give you a couple different verses. The first one's going to be Revelation chapter 20, verse 6. I'm going to put up a couple more for context, but I'm only going to read verse 6 for time's sake. Blessed and holy is he who has part in the first resurrection. Over such the second death has no power, but they shall be priests of God and of Christ, and shall reign with him 1,000 years. What I want you to gather from that verse is that they will reign with God, with Christ, for 1,000 years. So that puts it at the beginning. They're going to start reigning for 1,000 years at the beginning of that millennium, right? So it says very clearly that God will be reigning for 1,000 years during that millennial time. He is reigning. Now, where is he reigning from? That's what we're going to get to. So let's go to now Psalm 132. I'm going to start in verse 13. For the Lord has chosen Zion. He has desired it for his dwelling place. This is my resting place forever. Here I will dwell, for I have deserved it. I will abundantly bless her possession. I will satisfy her poor with bread. I will also clothe her priests with salvation, and her saints shall shout aloud for joy. There I will make the horn of David grow. I will prepare a lamp for my anointed. His enemies I will clothe with shame, but upon himself his crown shall flourish. A couple key things in this passage. One is that the Lord has chosen Zion as a dwelling place. That's where he chooses to dwell. It will be his resting place forever. But it also alludes to, in verse 18, his enemies will clothe with shame. So it still gives that idea that outside the gates there will be enemies, sorcerers, impure people. Outside the gates though. So even during the millennial time, there are sinners. This is the point I am making right here. So the next passage, we're going to Micah, chapter 4, verses 1 through 7. I'm going to chop it up a little bit there. I'll have the verses for context, but I'm going to be reading from the first verse and the last verse. It says, Now it shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established on the top of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills, and peoples shall flow into it. Many nations shall come and say, Come and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, and we shall walk in his paths. For out of Zion the law shall go forth, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between many peoples, and rebuke strong nations afar off. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their shears into pruning hooks. Nations shall not lift up the sword against nation. Now I'm going to go to verse 7. So the Lord will reign over them in Mount Zion, from now on, even forever. So that little passage right there was describing what the millennium is going to look like. It says in the latter days, and that's referring to the millennium. So it says there will not be war. They're going to beat their swords into plowshares, so they're not going to be used for war as weapons. They're going to be used for gardening and things like that. It also mentions many nations coming up to the mountain of Zion, the mountain of God. And we don't have time to look into other passages, but there are other passages that say the exact same thing, like Zechariah So you can check that out. But like I said in verse 7, it says, the Lord will reign over them in Mount Zion. So we already established in Revelation 20 that the Lord will be reigning for 1,000 years. And then we established in Psalm 32 that Mount Zion is God's dwelling place in the latter days. And in Micah 4, during the latter days, he's going to be reigning from Mount Zion. And from Mount Zion, the law will go forth. So now let's give one more verse that ties it all together. And that's in Hebrews chapter 12. Now you can read the whole chapter, of course, but I'll briefly sum it up. It's a contrast between Mount Sinai and Mount Zion. So Mount Sinai was the first time that God came down onto a mountain, and now Mount Zion will be the last time that God comes down. And there are some differences and contrasts, but I just want to pick it up in verse 22. But you have come to Mount Zion, and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, to an innumerable company of angels, to the general assembly and the church of the firstborn who are registered in heaven, to God, the judge of all, to the spirits of just men made perfect, to Jesus, the mediator, and of the new covenant, and to the blood of sprinkling that speaks better things than that of Abel. That verse right there sums it all up and brings it all together. It says that Mount Zion is the city of the living God and is the heavenly Jerusalem, or the New Jerusalem. It's the same exact thing. Now, I did a previous video, and I'll try and put the link up here, that gives like 30 different verse comparisons of Mount Zion in the Old Testament and the New Jerusalem in the New Testament, and how they are very much the same thing. So, and that verse right there just ties it up all beautifully in a bow. So, what did we learn so far? We know that Jesus and God reign for 1,000 years. Where do they reign from? They reign from Mount Zion. What is Mount Zion? It is the New Jerusalem. So if they are reigning for 1,000 years from the New Jerusalem, doesn't it make sense that the New Jerusalem would be at the beginning of the 1,000 years? That makes the most sense to me. Yes, God, if you put it here at the end, God will be reigning. But there were very specific words too in those passages that say there are evil people outside the walls. The law will be going forth from the city to other people who do not know the law or keep the commandments. They are still sinners outside of the New Jerusalem. So it doesn't quite make sense to put it at the end. Now, put it at the beginning, it makes a lot more sense. So that was the first path of how to get to the New Jerusalem being at the beginning. And now let's go into the second one. I want to go to Romans chapter 8. And the verses that we're going to be studying in this passage are roughly verses 18 through 24, but I'm going to be breaking it down almost verse by verse. But I'm going to go ahead and start reading. For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. For the earnest expectation of creation eagerly waits for the revealing of the sons of God. So I just want to stop right there and kind of make sure we're all on the same page here. They're suffering, right? The Christians are suffering in this present time, but it isn't worthy to be compared to glory which will be revealed in us. Revealed is a very important word there. It's apocalypsis, which is the book of Revelation. It's the apocalypse. Sometimes it's translated the apocalypse of John, right? The vision that John had. It's the revealing, the unveiling of Jesus. In other words, modern day times we think of apocalypse as like destruction and things like that, because there is a lot of destruction in the book of Revelation, but it's just revealing. It is taking what is covered and unveiling it. So when it talks about the glory that will be revealed in us, it's talking about our heavenly bodies, right? Inside we are dwelled with the Holy Spirit, but these are still mortal and fleshly bodies on the outside. So there will be something that is greater to be revealed. In verse 19, it says that creation eagerly awaits the revealing of the sons of God. So the sons of God in the New Testament is referring to Christians. Whereas in the Old Testament, I did another video on that. Again, I'll try to put the link there. But it is very much talking about angels. That's a whole nother video, but when the phrase sons of God appears, it is like 9 out of 10 times angels. But in the New Testament, when it talks about sons of God, it is talking about Christians and believers. And there was that word again, the revealing of the sons of God. So just put a pin in that and I'll keep reading. For creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it in hope. Because the creation itself also will be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groans and labors with birth pangs together until now. So I want to stop there again and explain what's going on here. Creation is laboring and groaning because creation also has a curse on it. Let's go back really quick to Genesis chapter 3 where the fall happens. But we're going to go to verses 17 and 18. Then to Adam he said, because you have heeded the voice of your wife and have eaten from the tree of which I commanded you, saying, you shall not eat of it, cursed is the ground for your sake. In toil you shall eat of it, in all the days of your life. Both thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the herb of the field. I'm not sure if you knew that before, but at the fall, when Adam and Eve sinned, the ground was also cursed. Creation was cursed as well, and is degrading, and has been from that time until now. Just like it says there in verse 22, the whole creation groans and labors together until now. If we go back to verse 20, it says, creation was subjected to futility, not willingly. And that's talking about that curse. It wasn't creation's fault, but it was Adam's fault. It wasn't willingly that creation was subjected to futility. It wasn't willingly, that's for sure. But it's because of what Adam did there in the fall of man. So creation is also groaning and laboring in pain for when creation itself will be justified, rejuvenated, and given a facelift, basically. And when will this happen? When is creation going to get the facelift? It said there at verse 18 that they're waiting for the revealing of the sons of God. Verse 18 and verse 19. So when the sons of God are revealed, that's when creation is going to get a new creation. And what comes along with the new creation? The new heavens and new earth. So real quick, what does it mean when it says the revealing of the sons of God? Let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 15. I'm going to pick it up in verse 51. Behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised incorruptible, and we shall be changed. For this corruptible must put on incorruptible, and this mortal must put on immortality. So when this corruptible has put on incorruptible, and this mortal has put on immortality, then shall be brought to pass the saying that is written, death is swallowed up in victory. Does this make it any more clear for you? The revealing of the sons of God is when Christ returns. Now, there's also debate of whether Christ returns at the beginning of the tribulation or at the end. I say it's at the end, of post-tribulation, and I did a whole other video on that. I'll try to link it up there. So in short, the revealing of the sons of God is when Christ returns at the last trumpet, right? Does that make sense? It's the last trumpet. When Christ returns, that's when the sons of God will be revealed. That's when the sons of God are changed in the twinkling of an eye. What is corruptible becomes incorruptible. What is mortal becomes immortal. That's the revealing of the sons of God. And if we cross-reference that with Romans 8, what we just read, creation is waiting for the revealing of the sons of God. And the sons of God are revealed when Jesus returns. And when does Jesus return? It's at the beginning of the millennium. So Jesus returns, sons of God are given their heavenly bodies, they are revealed, and when that happens, earth also will be given a new creation. There's going to be a new heavens and new earth, and that's going to be at the beginning of the millennium. Just for a little more context, I want to throw another verse in there from 2 Peter chapter 3, starting in verse 10. It says, "But the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in which the heavens will pass away, and with great noise, and the elements will melt with fervent heat. Both the earth and the works that are in it will be burned up." So the day of the Lord here is not talking about the tribulation, like many people incorrectly come to that conclusion. It's not the day of the Lord as tribulation. The day of the Lord is the day that Jesus comes back. And when Jesus comes back, that's the revealing of the sons of God. That's the new creation. It says right there, the day of the Lord comes as a thief in the night. It's not talking about a secret rapture. It's talking about the day Jesus comes back. He's going to come without warning, kind of. And that's what thief in the night means. But what also happens there when the day of the Lord happens? The heavens will pass away with great noise. The elements will melt. That's not happening at the beginning of the tribulation. Clearly that's a misconception and just wrong. So watch that other video about when is the rapture. It's not pre-trib, it's post-trib. But that's besides the point. I just wanted to throw that in there to kind of solidify, this idea, this timeline, the real timeline. It all lines up perfectly. And before we finish up, I want to still read Revelation chapter 21, verses 1 through 3. "Now I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and first earth passed away, and there was no more sea. Then I, John, saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from heaven saying, 'Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people. God himself will be with them and be their God.'" So again, when did we establish that there will be a new heaven and a new earth? That was at the revealing of the sons of God, when Christ returns. So that new heaven and new earth is sometime after Jesus comes back. Now there are events that need to take place. It is still going to happen in sequential order. For example, let's go back to Jesus' birth. When Jesus was born, it's not like he immediately died on the cross. He still had to grow up. He still had to give his teachings and travel around Jerusalem, teach the disciples, and then he still needed to be handed over. He needed to die on the cross. He needed to be buried, and he needed to rise again. And that all didn't happen instantaneously. It took time, and it had to go through the certain order. So the same thing again will happen at the end times when Jesus returns. It's not like immediately there's a new heaven and new earth right when Jesus returns. Some events are going to happen. They're going to take a couple days to happen. The Battle of Armageddon. Jesus could certainly wipe them out, but I believe it's going to probably take a couple days, a couple day battle, just to finish that up. And then you got to clean everything up. What I'm saying is that it doesn't have to all happen on the same exact day at the same time. It can be spread out between a couple days, a couple weeks, and I'm gonna hopefully clear that up in just a little bit. So again, we took a different path now, and we still ended up with the New Jerusalem at the beginning of the millennium. When Christ returns, the believers are transformed, and that's when there is a new heaven and new earth. These key key words, the thief in the night, the heavens and earth passing away, when all these things happen, it just makes more sense at the beginning of the millennium. And I hope that's clear for you. Again, I want to ask you, like I did in the beginning, when is the New Jerusalem? Does it make more sense at the beginning? And where is God reigning from? I think we established pretty clearly that God and Jesus reign from the New Jerusalem, from Mount Zion. And that comes down at the beginning of the millennium. So it makes sense that God and Jesus would be reigning in the New Jerusalem for 1,000 years. A couple other things that will actually make more sense. Remember, we read those verses where outside the gates are sinners, the sexually immoral, the witchcraft people, dogs and sorcerers. They are outside of the gates. So if the New Jerusalem is at the end of the millennium, it doesn't make sense that they'd still be around. But with the New Jerusalem at the beginning of the 1,000 years, there is no sin or corruption inside the New Jerusalem. There are many verses that support that. But outside, there can still be sinful people. And we don't have time to go into a whole in-depth study, but you can check out some of those other videos I made. So it just makes a lot more sense that there are still sinners around during that 1,000 years. Because at the end of 1,000 years, that's when sin, death, and Hades are thrown into the lake of fire. There's still sin on the earth, but not inside the city, only outside the gates. So hopefully that clears that up a little bit for you. It still seems very likely that it's at the beginning. It just, a lot more things make sense and line up. It's like a puzzle piece. If it's here at the end, it's like that puzzle piece. It's just not quite fitting. There are a couple verses that just don't match up. But if we put it at the beginning, all of a sudden the puzzle piece lines up and you can see the bigger picture. Well, now I'd like to finish up by telling you about the feast, and it's going to be a quick run through. But Jesus fulfilled the spring feasts while he was first here on the earth. Jesus died as the Passover lamb, which is the Feast of Passover. And then the Feast of Unleavened Bread is when Jesus was buried for a couple days in the ground. When Jesus rose again, that's the Feast of First Fruits. He was the first fruits of the resurrection. So Jesus accomplished those in quick succession. The Passover, unleavened bread, first fruits, all right in a row. And then 50 days later is Pentecost, or Shavuot, where the Holy Spirit came down. So all of those happened very quickly and in order. But wait, there's more. The fall feasts have not been fulfilled yet. So how will they be fulfilled? The first one to come is the Feast of Trumpets. Now I made another video, I'll link that up there, where the Feast of Trumpets is also known as the day and hour nobody knows, because it happens on the new moon, and nobody knows when the new moon is, because there is no moon. Anyhow, watch that video. But the Feast of Trumpets is the first one, and Jesus will come back on the last trumpet. Remember, we read in 1 Corinthians. And then there are 10 days of awe until the Feast of Atonement, the Day of Atonement. So during those 10 days, it's a little bit unsure what's going to happen, but it's kind of like a redemptive period. You got 10 days to get yourself right with God. And then on that Day of Atonement is historically when the sins were atoned for. And we'll probably be seeing that again in the end times. Now there are 5 more days after that before the Feast of Tabernacles. Now it's just a theory right now, and I'm not sure I can prove it, but between the Feast of Atonement and the Feast of Tabernacles, during those 5 days, that's when I'm thinking there's the new heaven and new earth. And when the elements are burning up and melting. Remember I said things happen in time. Like when Jesus first came, it wasn't all boom, boom, boom. It had to go through time. So it is with the fall feast, the Feast of Trumpets. Jesus is going to come back. There's going to be war. There's going to be some more testifying and redemption going on before the Day of Atonement. And then during those 5 days, that's what I'm thinking is the new heaven and new earth. And then the Feast of Tabernacles is going to be when the New Jerusalem comes down from heaven. I want to read again Revelation chapter 21, verse 3. And I heard a loud voice from heaven saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people. God himself will be with them and be their God. Boom. That sums it all up right there. So if we actually see the fall feast as being accomplished in that order, just like Jesus did with the spring feast when he first came, those fall feasts, if they happen just like that, the New Jerusalem should be coming down during the Feast of Tabernacles, because it said right there, the New Jerusalem coming down out of heaven. God is going to tabernacle with man again. Man, I think that is just so clear and so profound. If we look at these feasts, it's amazing how they all line up with Scripture. God gave us his plan all the way back in the Old Testament, in Leviticus. So it's just amazing putting all these pieces together. And indeed, if that's when the New Jerusalem comes down at the Feast of Tabernacles, it's going to be at the beginning of the Millennium. Just after, in fact, 15 days after Jesus comes back. 15 days later is when the Feast of Tabernacles is, and that's when I see the New Jerusalem coming down out of heaven, when God tabernacles with man once more. I hope you enjoyed the video. Hope you got something very useful out of it. There are a lot of passages in there that are not very familiar, very popular, but I encourage you to go back and study those in more depth, and hopefully they'll become more clear the more you look into it. Again, if you liked it, give me a thumbs up, share some comments down there, what you learned, share it with a friend so they can learn it too. And as always, stay in the Word, study the Word, put on the full armor of God every day, and God bless.